Again, I would like to welcome everyone to this Responsible Innovation Summit. This is day 3 of the summit. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you, wherever you're joining from. Today, we're going to be providing interesting insights into inclusive innovation. And we're going to be drawing from empirical findings on living innovation research that's been taking place for a couple of years now. And today we've got about 7 speakers with us. And then Rosanna will be speaking to us about inclusive innovation, inclusive design. We've got Klaus Peter with us too. He's the head of Siemens and Accessibility Competence Center. And he's going to be speaking to us about a case study, how to work with visually impaired people. And next, we're going to have Catherine, and Catherine is a reader in computing and social responsibility at the Montfort University here in the UK. She's going to take us through the second case study, which speaks to how to work with families in disadvantaged localities. We also have Mike's with us. Mike has a video recording. So he is going to be reflecting on inclusive innovation. I think that's going to draw on further take on what Catherine will be talking about. After that, we've got Eileen. Eileen is a professor emeritus, information systems and technology, gender, women, and sexuality studies at Pennsylvania State University. It's going to be looking at reflection on inclusive innovation. And then finally, we have David Cole, who is a guest researcher at Newcastle University and the director of Enhanced International Limited UK. Is going to also reflect on inclusive innovation from ethics perspective. Just a few housekeeping before we continue. I would like to say that if you've got questions, you could put those questions in the chat area. We'll look out for those questions and put them together until the end of these sessions. We're going to have something like a panel question and answer session at the end of all the presentations. And at this time, I would like you all to please ensure that your microphone remains mute so that we'll minimize disruption and distraction. And so I would like to kick off by welcoming Rosanna. Thank you very much. Rosanna, are you there?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think it's worked now. Yes. Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for the introductions. And yeah, it's really good to be here today talking about inclusive innovation. And in this short introductive sort of presentation for the day, we just want to pull out some strings together from our collaboration in the Living Innovation Project and how we came about the concept of inclusive innovation. So what is inclusive innovation? Here you have, you can see a lovely artwork that was produced by some research participants in our project. And this is an innovative idea for a space hoover that can tidy the house by sorting by category. So it is able to put Lego pieces into the Lego box. You can see 5 categories: Lego, cars, dolls, sports, and board games. So this was an idea for an innovation that does not exist yet, and that emerged from a workshop in our project. Why could this be? Why would you refer to this as inclusive innovation? So to start with, the team at the Montfort University, as well as the team at the Siemens, we wanted to work with groups of people that are not very often asked about the future of technology. And as you will see today from the two main presentations, and thinking about a joint action that we could do together, we came across this concept of inclusive innovation. This is not a well-defined academic concept. We came up with it as a name for our joint action, and then looking around, we found some that it's been used in some other places as well, sort of more loose meaning or more well-defined in other places. But just for today, just to draw some things together and to discuss what can inclusive innovation be. So if we go to the next slide, a good way to start about thinking about inclusive innovation is by looking at inclusive design principles. So inclusive design has been around for a while, and it's a well-established direction in design and design research. And some of the main principles of inclusive designs are the fact that good design comes from understanding user diversity. So a focus on user diversity as in inclusive innovation exists in inclusive design as well. Another principle is to aim to include as many people as possible with a wide range of abilities and needs. Flexibility in use is the next principle. So when you're thinking about designing a new product or service, it will be ideal if that product can adapt to users' abilities. So it's not the case that it can be used in a single way, but the product can adapt to the user. And one of the main aims of inclusive design is to extend the reach of mainstream products. So rather than designing specialized products only for specific groups of people, rather design a general product or service, but you can design it in a way that everyone can use it. So if it's got that flexibility of use, then you can have a very wide range of uses. And one example, which it's discussed on the Inclusive Design Toolkit, where you can find more about inclusive design if you are interested, is the OXO Good Grips, a case study on OXO Good Grips, which is a range of products that are ergonomically designed, so they are easier to use. They don't hurt your hand. You can use them even if you have abilities that are affected by specific any causes, a disease or any other causes. So if this is an example of a mainstream product that is flexible, can be used by a user with great abilities and can be used by someone who might be struggling with a different product. So that was inclusive design. And now when we talk about inclusive innovation, we think this is a very good basis to start inclusive design. So follow this inclusive design principles. Plus, what do we need to get from design to innovation? We can involve the users in the innovation process itself. What does this mean? We can ask people what product they need, rather than asking them to just test a product we have prototyped. So we can start a step behind, rather than the designer coming with an idea for a product. We can ask people, and we can involve participation from all sectors of society, ask anyone and everyone. Another Another plus of this approach is that this can bring new ideas, as we have shown with the idea for the space hoover, which came out from one of our workshops. So I've tried to keep this really short. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions, we can talk more at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. Thank you. That's brilliant presentation. And please, if you've got questions, do not hesitate to put those questions at the chat area. We're going to pick them up and ask at the end of this session. So next, please welcome Klaus-Peter. He will be speaking to us on how to work with visually impaired people. Thank you, Klaus-Peter.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Yes, what means the inclusion of persons with disabilities, especially with blind and visually impaired persons. The motivation for that, and this is the start of my presentation, is the concept of design for all. Design for all is essential for 10% of the population, necessary for 40% of the population, and hopefully comfortable for 100% of the population. And who wants to disregard 40% of possible customers? So I would like to give you a short introduction motivation. What is it about disabilities? Then I want to go more in details. What are the special tools we developed for usage in workshops for persons with visually impairments and blind persons? And then I would like to give you some examples and some ideas how things moved in the times of Corona, because this changed completely the concept of our two workshops. What is it? Accessible design. People with disabilities have limited sensory abilities, that means seeing, hearing, or touch, feeling, or motoric problems, that means moving, grasping, fine motoric handling, and so on, and of course some cognitive. We will concentrate on visually impaired and blind persons. Products and services shall be barrier-free if they are detectable, reachable, and usable for persons with disabilities. And that's now the crucial, the essence of this part, in the usual way, without particular difficulties, and as a rule, without help from others. This is the target when we talk about creating new products. We would like to give you some impressions. Usage with reduced impairments, with reduced vision, with no vision, with low vision, with limited vision, with limited or without color perception. And of course, sometimes you need aids to have a clear view on things. This should demonstrate you that we are talking not about a homogeneous user group. This is an extremely wide user group with very wide different needs. The next slide will demonstrate you the challenges when you are in an environment and have some problems with seeing. This explains you what you see from your environment with the different types of reduced vision. Imagine you are at a workshop, and I think you are always at workshops, and all these boring workshops happen, and you know the methods in these workshops. And if you have a clear vision on the screens and the documents and so on, it's quite easy to follow them. But as soon as it comes to some reduced vision, you suddenly get not the complete message of what happens in the workshop. And you may know or identify the used tools on this slide, but if you see only parts of them, you are excluded from the workshop. And of course, you are excluded from the results, your participation. And at the end of the story, you are not able to follow and to contribute to the workshop. What we would like to show you are 7 ideas or methods how to include persons with visual impairments and blind persons. 3 are for the preparation of workshops, and 4 are for the doing, the performance of the workshops. The first is the question, shall I split the groups of participants? Typically, because of different needs, blind and visually impaired persons are often separated. And it is always the question, is this reasonable or not? If you are designing for a mainstream product, which is used by most users, for example, an ATM, cash machine, payment system, a ticket machine, and so there seems to be a good reason to not split up the group. If you are designing for a group, especially for a product like a TV or an own-used and on-board product, then it might be sensible to not split up the group. The next big question is how to contribute the information to the users. Of course, the first thing which comes up to mind is to use large print. That's easy. But there may be persons who need Braille or want to have information in Braille, or who want to have information in acoustic books, in acoustic form, in advance to the workshop. And there are different methods to provide these different things. You can, for example, print Braille by connecting a Braille printer to a computer. That means you have to have this equipment by hand. But there are so-called translate services in the internet, for example, where you can say, oh, I need this document in Braille, or I need this document in large print. And of course, it's very interesting and challenging if you say, oh, I want to do it by my own. I do it by myself. And this gives you the possibility to create a document by your own. For example, you can use a computer with a character set in Braille, print it out on a special swallow paper, and then put it in the oven, and the dots will raise by the heat. And you can use this mechanism also to make simple drawings and provide them to the users. The next slide shows you an example. This is a questionnaire where we put large print and Braille together in one document. This was the questionnaire of a success or the output of a workshop. Facilitation in the workshop, of course, needs something, we call it recorder. That means you need persons who help and assist the participants in their work. And we identified 3 types of recorders. The first type is the prompter. This person records the discussion in a breakout group. And then when the results are presented, this person prompts, gives some hints, makes some points so that the participants are able to speak on their own, and they are only guided through this process by saying something, you missed this, or what happens with this and that. So this is the most interesting and the most efficient way, but sometimes the groups are not able to do it in this way. And therefore, you need the second type who reads out the content of what they have noted or what the recorder has noted. This in this case, questions were put on the table and answered. And the third concept of a recorder is really the recorder tries to present the output in the sense in the discussion of the discussion group. Okay, now it comes up to the real workshop. What are reasonable things you can use during the workshop? And one of these things are 3D printouts, 3D models. That helps you to get hands on things, to can touch on things. It's not so flexible because printing in 3D takes some time, so you have to prepare before the workshop, but you have very good, precise and stable models which you can use during the workshops. Another option is, and this turned out to be a very interesting issue, is to use building blocks, or to say it simpler, to play with Lego. This is very exciting because you can change things by moving the stones around. You can discuss, you can show people your ideas very, very quickly by using a fixed raster of the presentation. If you don't use Legos, you can use tactile foils. These are very small, thin films. You can raise lines on these films by a ball pen. This is a method you can make very quickly some lines, some drawings, some easy explanations, and can be used during the discussion. Touch can also be used when you are using, for example, cards or other materials, other gadgets, which have some tactical haptic experience. For example, you can mark blue, red, yellow cards by cutting off different edges or make holes in the card and so on. You have to be a little bit creative. And in many of the workshops, you have stimulating issues like pictures, figures, which shall be used for association tasks. This does not work with low vision and blind persons, but you can, for example, use sounds to stimulate the imagination, to stimulate the process. We can have made some experience of how to use these sounds, how to create these sounds, how to not use them. And one very important issue is to have a good quality of the sounds. No recording with your mobile phone, but a high quality. And this is very interesting and needs some ideas to approve it, and it takes some time to find the right method to select the right sounds. Pre-production. Pre-production always means you have to prepare the workshops, and we did this especially for the selecting and recruiting process by the help of organizations of persons with disabilities, because they have some infrastructure to inform the participants and how to create trust with them and so on. And of course, it is crucial to have a small interview in front before the workshop with participants to identify what is their interest, what affinity to technologies do they have, what are their special needs. And of course, you can move the process of informed consent to this early stage to not waste time during the workshop. Successful practical workshop and successful workshop is, of course, to set up an accessible location. Work material, prepare the right work material, and of course, to brief your assistant facilitators as explained before. The next two slides show you do's and don'ts. And maybe this is self-evident, maybe it's new for you. If you want to help a blind person, approach the person and offer the help, not just touch the person. Use normal language. Terms like see you again or something like that is reasonable and no problem. And it is more than polite just to present yourself with your name when contributing to a discussion, because it's sometimes not easy if you have a bigger group to identify a person by his voice. When giving a presentation, you have to verbalize everything of important information on your slides. It is very useful to provide documents in accessible electronic formats before the workshop, because some people like to read them on their own computer or own reading device. Provide an acoustical, quiet environment. That means not your overhead beamer should make a lot of noise. Not the air condition system should make the most noise in the room, and so on. Ensure that there is sufficient lighting for those who have a remaining vision. And of course, you need to describe the position of important things in the room and outside the room. What you should not do is address directly the blind person, not their, address directly the blind person always, not their companion. Never touch a guide dog when it is on duty. Avoid disability-specific or discriminating language. Do not make assumptions about what the blind person is not capable of doing. And of course, you have to avoid obstacles in the room. We conducted 2 workshops, which were very different. One was about creating radio devices. The other one was about improving the mobility services for persons with reduced mobilities. The first one was a physical one, and we had participants from all over Germany, of all ages, and a very, very technical affiliated group. And that was the group we played around with Lego, and there are some on the next 2 slides, some impressions about how this workshop went. And the output of this workshop, I will only summarize that we have designed a certain type of radio equipment, which is now available. The second workshop, Smart Mobility, went in a very, very different direction. There are, with the digitalization of public transport, a lot of new issues where people with disabilities are excluded, especially visually impaired and blind persons. And we started with a physical workshop, collecting the needs and the requirements and collecting ideas. And we continued this as online workshops, and as the participants were so eager to continue, we had more than 12 follow-up online workshops. But this brings us to the point we had to go to online workshops, and this was a real pain because we had to figure out how to continue with this group. That means we had to train the participants, we had to give them advice how to use the online tools, to figure out the right online tools. And there were a lot of technical issues we have to play around with and to get this things running. And we invested a lot of time to start this process. Meanwhile, we are very familiar with this online meetings. And so from workshop to workshop, we solved a lot of problems, and it was getting more smooth. Nevertheless, we have to make more pauses. We have to make more explanations. You cannot help single persons, and the idea to break out sessions is not very good, because in the breakout sessions you have to bring people back again, and these are sometimes very technical issues, and this should not disrupt the workshop. So we learned a lot about how these workshops can be done. We had a lot of participants who said we want to continue because they saw and see the progress, and the output of these workshops is currently collected in a standard, in a norm, which is published as a draft now and will be published end of the year. And we hope that the output of this workshop will come up with new solutions for persons with reduced mobility in Europe in the near future. And that's the success of the workshops. If you have any questions, I'll be available later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Klaus-Peter. We will thoroughly enjoy that presentation. It's amazing to see different approaches that we could use to engage visually impaired or blind people. So we move to the next case study, and this will be taken by Catherine, working with families in disadvantaged localities of Leicester. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Adeboale. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the workshops that Roxana talked about very briefly at the very beginning, and looking at working with families in disadvantaged localities. So we come from Leicester in the UK, which has a really high deprivation rate. 1 in 4 Leicester residents live in the 10% most deprived part of England. 1 in 4 children live in areas of high income deprivation, and 1 in 3 people live in areas of high education deprivation. And this is just an example of where this is Leicester, and these are the areas where we were really targeting originally in-person workshops to do art workshops with children and their families. And so the areas in red are the most deprived parts, and we were going to go into the community centres there and work with the families in these areas. But of course, what happened was we had COVID. So I'll get onto that in a little bit, what we did. But the reason that we wanted to do this was that I've been doing a lot of responsible research and innovation projects for a really long time now. And one of the things that I found along the way is that there are there's a lot of discourse about working with citizens, working with, like getting people involved in technology discussion and development. But when I've actually seen this in practice, it's all been the same sorts of people. It's mostly been middle-class white people who have the time to come to full-day workshops, who can take a day without pay, who don't need to have childcare potentially or have childcare already. And basically those sorts of people keep getting invited back because they're the sort of people who can come to these things. So this actually has the potential to really shape technology development across Europe. And it's not for the best, it's not in, I mean, it's nice to get people, but we need to be really doing better than that. And particularly in the public engagement. So one of the key principles of responsible innovation, according to the European Union, is that it implies a two-way, iterative, inclusive, and participatory process of multi-actor exchanges and dialogues, also including involving minorities, considering gender and multiple generations. And we just don't see that when it comes to actual projects. We see the same people all the time. And I have this picture of focus groups, Google search, because it shows the sorts of, like, they're mostly middle-aged white people. So our research questions with the Living Innovation Project were really about what are the visions for future technologies for families with low digital capital, which is what we were looking at in terms of disadvantaged localities. And to what extent has the lockdown affected these visions? So we ended up doing a series of workshops online, and we recruited across Leicester. So we couldn't, we focused on trying to recruit people in those locations, but it was very hard for us to say no to anybody else that wanted to come along. But we actually did have roughly half of our participants came from parts of Leicester that are considered within those deprivation areas, just according to where they picked their locality. Most of our families only had phone internet, like mobile phone internet. We had 12 families with at least one adult and one child above 6 years old. All families completed all 3 workshops and a follow-up Zoom interview, which was really great for retention. So if anyone's ever done longitudinal studies, you know that you lose a lot of people. We didn't lose anyone, which is really nice. We had mostly non-white families, which also reflects the diversity of Leicester. Leicester is roughly 50-50 white, non-white. And we gave our families a £40 shopping voucher to complete the workshops, just as a recognition of the time that they spent doing these workshops with us. And as you can see down the bottom, we had 100% satisfaction with the workshop. So they all enjoyed it, which is good. So what we did in terms of the workshops themselves was we had 3 online asynchronous art workshops, and we recruited a local artist who was actually the original guy we were going to use for the in-person workshops to develop a series of videos to inspire and get creative juices flowing, so to speak. And then we just did a remarkably complex email organization of having to email the problems out to each week we would send an email to each of the family telling them what they had to do for the week. We'd then invite them to send an email back. We'd then process that. We'd then set up the next email because we had to, as you'll see, we had to switch things around a little bit. And it worked actually surprisingly well. And of course, we'd have to send out reminder emails. So there's a lot of email overhead on this, but it worked out really well. So we did a sort of a design thinking light type scenario situation where we gave each family, we asked each family to come up with a problem in their home that future technologies could potentially solve. And then we switched problems. So each family switched problems and they came up with solutions to a different family's problem. And then we gave that solution back to the original family and we asked them to either modify it to, make it better or suit their purposes more or whatever, or come up with a new idea of a solution if they didn't like the original solution. So just an example here, we had family 1 gave us this lovely picture about being bored under lockdown. And there's a child there saying, this TV program is boring and I hate lockdown. Mummy, I'm bored, says another child, and Mummy's in the kitchen up the top there saying, I'm busy. And I always liked the fact that this child wrote help up the top. So we gave that to another family. And the family, it's worth mentioning, this was done in June of last year. So it was mid-lockdown, it was about, 8-9 weeks into lockdown. So all the novelty of that had worn off pretty much. So family 2 came up with a boredom buster app thing, and it's like a machine that will ask you what you want to do and then spit out all the things that you need to be able to do it. So if you want to do creative stuff, sports, science, etc., it would have all of these things that would help you do it. And then the family 1 got that back and they decided the best thing they could do with that is actually put it in a physical robot. And this is one of my favorite pictures from the whole workshop. This beautifully colored robot that asks the child, what do you want to do on the boredom buster today? And the little child says, can I play with you? And then they have the original thing in its stomach, essentially. So I love that. Here are some of the problems. I'm not going to go through them in huge detail, but as you can see, lockdown was a big influence on our families. So we have a picture of lockdown 2020 where the kids couldn't get out of school and they could see the park from the house, but they couldn't go there. There's a mental health in the bottom left-hand corner, which we'll talk about. We actually have the family who will talk about that themselves. Mess was a big issue. Obviously, if you're stuck in the house, you're noticing all of the mess that's around. So we have the mess up in the top left-hand corner with lots of stuff everywhere and down the bottom right-hand corner as well. And then people were seeing all the insects and things that come into their house more frequently. So there was ants and spiders and all sorts of pictures of things coming into people's houses that they didn't like. And also we had communication problems, and particularly with people whose first language was not English, having to use lots of technologies to replace in-person school and things like that was proving quite difficult. So these were some of the problems that they came up with. And of course, they came up with some solutions as well. So we had translator applications, we had clean the mess apps, we had virtual reality homes, we had ant zappers, we had space hoovers, we had all sorts of different solutions, which are really cool. And then finally, the final versions of these ended up being things like the board and buster robot. We had the Hoover, the space Hoover that Roxana showed you before. And we have the butterfly translators. We have small ones for children and big ones for adults. The apps get gamified, et cetera, et cetera. So it was quite kind of cool seeing this process go past. So after that, we interviewed technologists about the technologies that they came up with. And you'll hear from one of those later as well. And we wanted to know if these seemed like feasible things that could potentially exist. And yes, is the answer, generally speaking. I mean, some of them are more feasible than others. Obviously, like we had one that was a flying house, so probably slightly less feasible. But everyone, like these sort of cutting edge technology people that we interviewed seemed really positive about the ideas that these families were coming up with. So I just wanted to just go through the take-home messages that we had from this is that technology needs diverse voices to present problems, co-create solutions, and show their needs. And that ethical approaches such as responsible research and innovation advocate engaging with all stakeholders, but in reality, this is hard to do with traditional methods. So alternative methods to traditional focus groups, etc., are necessary to elicit thoughts, feelings, concerns, and hopes for the future from non-traditional stakeholders. Working with low-income families and traditional workshops would have mostly only engaged non-working mothers with children. So this is one of the things we found along the way, that mostly these sorts of workshops, they would take their kids along to on the weekend mostly, or during the week while the main breadwinner would be at work. And one of the nicest things is that working asynchronously online allowed for all kinds of families to get involved with discussions over the dinner table, in the car and on walks, and with other members of the family that might not usually get involved. For example, working members of families, we had intergenerational collaboration, cousins that would come over just for the afternoon and they'd just get involved, grandmas, you know, it was, and one of the feedback things from one of the families, the father was so happy to be able to take part in this because he worked long hours, and they would save it for him for when he got back, and they would all sit around the dining table, eat dinner together, and go through the exercise of the week. And I just thought that was just so lovely, because that's not usually what you'd be able to get with an in-person workshop. So also the technologies that our families came up with, most of them already exist in some form, which is not, you know, unexpected really. But a lot of them, the reason why they're so fantastical to these kids and their families is that often they're just not accessible due to cost or availability. So lots of things like the virtual reality stuff, it's there, but it's really expensive, and especially for lower income families. So these are things that we really need to think about. You know, today's future technology, it already exists. Really, it's just going to be more accessible and cheaper, and and easier to use by people of all abilities and backgrounds. So I'm going to play a video now, which is from one of the families, and they're just going to reflect on the workshop process. And I'm just going to make sure. Yeah. So, yeah. To protect the privacy of the child, their faces will not be shown in this interview.
Thank you so much for joining me, Kusha and Bhavna. I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the artworks that you created for the Living Innovation Art Workshop back in July of last year. Do you want to just tell me a little bit about the problem that you created and why you chose that problem?
We chose the mental health because we thought that lockdown might affect your mental health because of all the stress of being stuck inside.
Yeah, and it was very stressful, wasn't it? And you came up with some really good ideas, and we can see the picture here of your lovely person with all of the stresses and worries that that they have, you know, coming out of their head, essentially, right? All right, so we had the issue of lockdown affecting mental health, and what was the solution that someone came up with for you?
They thought of a watch.
It was a TV, wasn't it, first?
Or an iPad, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an interactive TV, then I think an iPad, and finally a watch.
Yeah. You came up with the watch, didn't you? As a thing to help improve it, didn't you?
The or iPad. Yeah.
Yeah. And that and so did the result of the TV, do you think that would actually help with mental health in lockdown?
Yeah.
And the watch would just let you do things from afar, from the comfort of your sofa, for example?
Really hard to take a TV abroad.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah.
If you've got a car the same size as a Mini, if you've got a Mini, it's going to be a tiny boot.
That's right, it will be a tiny boot. So the watch is to actually bring the TV with you then, is it?
Yeah.
Brilliant. All right, and then you were presented with a problem, which was spiders in the house. So you came up with a spider sensory trap as a result of spiders in the house. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
What I thought was, because there are lots and lots of spiders in lots of people's houses, and we thought how to get rid of them without killing them. I thought something that the spiders wouldn't exactly see. So we thought of a plastic sheet with a sensor inside, so that if it felt something, you could then it would close, and it would look a bit like a pyramid. And we also thought to put holes in so the spider could breathe.
That's very kind of you. And then the second problem that you had to solve was chewing gum stuck in the house.
That was my mum.
All right, Mum, what did you come up with then?
It was a silicone bristle brush, which looks like a pebble, which then can be kept in the freezer, and then it squirts out liquid nitrogen when you're trying to get the chewing gum out, and it's got silicone bristles, so you can like sweep it away with the cold as it hardens.
So I'm just wondering, what is it that you enjoyed about the workshop?
I think I enjoyed all the ideas that we came up with, and afterwards seeing all the ideas that other people came up with, and then being able to modify one or two of them.
And has the workshop inspired you to think differently about technology or creating technology?
Yeah, because of I mean, the ideas that we came up with, if made real, would be very helpful.
I guess for me, I think being able to do it individually like this made you think with your vision, as opposed to having like lots of other people and just be kind of cajoled into one direction, which made it a bit more interesting, I think, from that perspective. And it was nice to work with him from a child's point of view, other than just having a grown-up point of view about some of this technology and what they wanted from it, I think.
Great. Anyway, so that's our video. And obviously I'll be happy to take questions at the end as well. So to protect the privacy, just realized
Thank you very much, Catherine. Wow, that's amazing. That's very interesting. Yes, let's just quickly move on because of our time. And I would like to invite the video from Mike. He'll be looking at reflection on some of these artwork that Catherine just spoke to us about. Can we have the video now? Thank you. Please.
So I'm Mike Jennings. I'm a technology writer and consultant type person. I write for most of the big UK technology titles. I sort of cover consumer tech, gaming tech, business tech. Yeah, that's about it. I'm always surrounded by tech. There's so much imagination here, and I really like that. Because you end up with people coming up with really creative ideas for solving problems. I mean, I'm looking at the boredom buster machine, for instance, which is, everyone's been bored during lockdown, and having a machine in your house that can almost give you a quiz to find out what you want to do is a great idea. And putting it in a robot is, I think, an even better idea, because it can do activities with you. It can come to you rather than you having to go to there. Feasibility wise, I think it's absolutely feasible, and it's something that you could add things onto as time goes on. You can add new games, add new activities, take things off. So yeah, I think there's a lot of imagination. I mean, there's robots, there's translators, there's recycling water bottles into new water bottles. There's loads of really good stuff. A lot of these ideas are really feasible because they're building on existing technologies in really interesting and imaginative ways. So we're all sort of used to our smartphones and our smart TVs, but you have ideas about lockdown affecting mental health and having more features on our watches to sort of monitor us and tell us what to do, and to, yeah, I think a lot of it is very feasible. Honestly, there's nothing here that I don't think could work. I think the virtual reality thing is an interesting one, because I've watched it over the past few years. It's kind of arrived. Everyone in the 80s was like, oh, VR is amazing. And then we've got to a point in the last 5-10 years where it started to become feasible in terms of people having it in their homes. But VR is still quite expensive. And because there's quite a slow uptake in VR hardware, it's sort of, there's less incentive for developers and companies to make these experiences. So I think the virtual reality home, with holidays and parks and video calls and health things and work things, is a brilliant idea. But if there's not the uptake there of virtual reality hardware, I don't think it's going to happen. But I do think that's sort of bringing experiences into your home. I think there's a lot there. I just wonder if VR is going to be the way it's going to happen, especially because with say a big screen, a television, or that's a different kind of screen that's mounted on a wall somewhere, that could be a communal experience. VR technology at the moment, you sort of have to shut yourself off in a lot of ways, because you stick a headset on and you're flailing around. So until either the VR tech dramatically changes and becomes a lot more accessible in terms of price, I'm not sure if VR is going to be the natural home for that sort of thing. I can't even understate how important it is. It's really, 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 really important. 4 reallys. Just because, I mean, I work in tech and I'm kind of surrounded by tech people all the time. And while the situation is improving a little bit in this respect, tech is still a really privileged world with a very narrow demographic of people in it. Inevitably, you have that relatively narrow demographic. And I think that means that people are going to come up with a pretty narrow band of solutions and ideas. And yeah, you open it up to people who wouldn't traditionally be working in like the tech industry, say, and you just get, as all these ideas show, you get huge amounts of imagination and creativity, and it's things that people in tech just wouldn't think of. And you might need the people in tech to like go away and implement the stuff, but in terms of generating ideas and coming up with interesting solutions, you don't get that in tech circles. As far as I'm concerned, really, the more voices you can get from a broader selection of communities and people, the better, really, because you will just get more interesting outcomes that work for a wider group of people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And let's quickly go to the next session now, and we'll have Hylene to speak to us on inclusive innovation now from gender perspective. You're welcome, Hylene.
Hello. Okay, I'm waiting for the overheads to appear. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so in my 20 plus years of research and writing and speaking about gender and technology, I've repeatedly been asked, what does gender have to do with technology? And more recently, what does gender have to do with innovation? And I think where this comes from is a perspective that technology is an artifact, rather than thinking of technology as the embodiment of the biases and the stereotypes and the assumptions of the people who are designing it. So next slide. So what I'd like to do is share some reflections on issues about innovations for women and innovations by women. Next slide. So one of the issue is gender biased innovations. So throughout the history of innovation, it is, as Mike was saying, tech tends to be developed by a rather narrow group of designers. So we've had a tendency to think of the normal user in technology developed sort of by men, with men in mind, and that would be the normal user. And the classic example of that fallacy is the automobile airbag. So it was assumed that this would be applicable to everybody, which is the case. The problem was the crash tests were only done on adult men and didn't take women and children into account, and sometimes very disastrous effects. I found it was an interesting example of innovations with women in mind. It was brought out in a recent book published this year by Katrine Marcel called Mother of Inventions, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built for Men. And the example that I was reading that she gives is the roller suitcase, which is now a technology that is commonplace in every area, airports, train stations, whatever. And when she was doing her research for her book, she saw ads in the 1950s, early 1950s, with a woman with a roller suitcase. It went nowhere until it was invented 20 years later, in the early 70s, by a man who then patented it. So the question is, what happened over those 20 years, and why was there an idea that was present in some of the ads? Why didn't this make it into suitcase manufacturing? Next slide. And her explanation is gender stereotypes. Real men carry their own luggage. Okay, and so this, of course, there's huge fallacies here with regard to, the intersectionality of masculinity with disability and all the reasons why you can be a real man and not be able to carry your own luggage. And the other is that the stereotype that women wouldn't travel on their own, that they would always have a man nearby to carry their bags. And I found this fascinating because clearly before 1972, I traveled alone and I didn't have somebody carrying my bags. So I think this is a very interesting example of something that was with women in mind, applicable to other people, but sort of ignored because of our stereotypes. Next slide, please. Now, the third example I want to give about issues with innovations for women is innovations apply to men, but because women do the majority of the caring, whether it's caring for the elderly or caring for children, I want to bring this to mind. And this has to do with assumptions. And again, this speaks directly. I'm so glad that Mike Jennings' video is right before my talk, because this exactly speaks to the problem when you have a narrow group of designers who either design for their own world of experience or design without having a world of experience. And when I speak to this, it's not just in my academic role, but in my personal role. My sisters and I spent several years caring for our elderly mother in the home of one of my sisters, who gratefully was an engineer. So there were a number of design issues that I think were built into equipment because the people designing it didn't understand the lived experience of the people, the lay people who would be using it. So none of us are healthcare professionals. So the first issue is that the mask, my mother had breathing problems, and so she had to wear this mask, and BiPAP refers to bi-level positive airway pressure. So when my mother would sleep, the mask, a full face mask would be on her face, and then it would pump oxygen into her while she was sleeping. So the first problem is there were two sizes, adult and child. However, adult was developed for men. So a woman's face, especially my mother's face, was a little bit smaller. And as she was aging, it was getting smaller. But her face was too big for a child's mask. So the second problem was the smart machine. And the smart machine was meant to sense when the seal would be broken. And the assumption was when the seal would be broken, that means a person is lifting off the mask and it would shut out. The problem is if it didn't have a tight seal, it would shut off while a person's sleeping. And I laugh about this. I see Catherine shaking her head. This is a life and death situation. My mother would shift in her sleep, the mask would shift, the seal would be broken, and the machine would turn off. It took considerable effort and force of personality to get the technicians to turn off that smart device so that my mother would not die in her sleep because she could not breathe. The final one is an assumption that I have yet to figure out what it was. The device to turn the machine on, when it was off, the light was green. And when you turned it on, the light went out. And I still, to this day, cannot figure out what assumptions, and I've traveled around the world, and everywhere that I've been, green always means on. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can talk about this more when we get into the discussion. Now I'd like to turn, next slide, to innovations by women. And throughout my work, and a lot of my research is devoted to barriers to women working in STEM, and a lot of the discussion and the narrative is about how do we get more women into it. My response is, there's not a problem getting women into it, just get out of the way. And I want to give you some examples. So in 1903, a woman named Mary Anderson, she got a patent on the windshield wiper. Before that, automobiles, trolley cars, and other devices required that the man stop, climb out, and wipe it with some kind of a rag. So she invented a device to wipe the windshield from inside. And when she tried, after she got the patent, when she tried to sell it, their response from the automakers was, we don't consider this to be of practical value. Now, the historians of technology have suggested the problem was she was single and didn't have a son or a husband or a father to make the argument. And there was a stereotype that what would a woman know about an automobile? The other example is Margaret Knight. And in 1868, she applied for a patent for a device to automate the making of a paper bag with a flat bottom. Now, before that, paper bags were made by hand and were very expensive. So she came up with this device. And as she was doing it and she developed her model, there was a man who saw the model. So he took the idea and he applied for a patent on his own. So she sued him. And then when they had to bring evidence to court, her evidence was the series of design drawings she had leading up to this model that she developed. His evidence was no woman would be capable of designing this machine, but she won the suit. So happy to know that. Okay, next slide. Now, most of my work is focused in the area of information technology. So computing and, again, the extreme underrepresentation of women in computing, and generally around the world, the issue has been that, IT and computing has been viewed as a male domain. But that's not the case. Women have been involved with computing from the very beginning, but they've literally been written out of history. So the first general purpose electronic digital computer, the ENIAC, was developed in 1946. All the programmers were women. And when the computer was introduced to the public, Eckert and Mauchly were there with the hardware, and the women were literally erased from it. And so all we saw was the men presenting this. And I used to teach in my courses the history of computing, and those women were never, ever represented. It's only been in recent years, but as recent as 1996, when there was the 50th anniversary of this first computer, somebody said, who are those women in these photographs? And the response was, oh, they were just models put in there. So now, lest we think this was just a problem of the 1940s and the 1960s, again, in Marcel's book, she says that right now, this book was published in 2021, less than 1% of venture capital funding in the UK goes to all women teams. Next slide. All right, now I'm going to end with Lillian Galbraith, and she is, I consider, the embodiment of gender issues with innovation. I was first introduced to her when I was a child because I saw the movie Cheaper by the Dozen. So she and her husband, Frank, were pioneers in the area of scientific management, or what you would call efficiency experts. They had 12 children, and a couple of their children wrote a book called Cheaper by the Dozen, which was then made into a film. But her life is fascinating, and I think she embodies these issues that I've been talking about. She had a PhD in psychology. She almost had a PhD in literature. She did have a PhD in psychology. She was an industrial engineer. She was a pioneer in ergonomics and scientific management. Her husband did not have a college degree. The two of them collaborated on efficiency designs, introducing Taylorism into design of buildings, manufacturing, all sorts of things. But when they wrote co-authored works, many times her name was left off of the publications because the publisher, well, what would a woman have to say about this? So his name appeared more than hers, even though she had the PhD, and he died unexpectedly at a young age. And so she went on for 48 more years to support her large family in her work, but she had to redirect it towards the domestic realm, because then that was acceptable, because that was this niche women's work. So she had this 48-year career where many of the designs that we consider commonplace, applicable to everyone, were actually designs that she did and that were considered sort of the niche innovations for women. And these are just a few of them, but she's got a fascinating life. I'll end with that, and we can pick up on more of this in the discussion. The last slide just has the reference to the book that I was mentioning. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Eileen. Thank you. That's very insightful. Number of social constructs that we see around today. Okay, so we move to the next and the final presentation today, and that will be coming from David, looking at inclusive innovation from ethics perspective. Please welcome David.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we've heard about inclusive innovation, and I think, as Catherine put it, it's essential for responsible research and innovation, which is an ethical approach to innovation. Important and key in it is that it involves society at an early stage. Can we have the first slide, please? Or the next slide. Thanks. So to be effective, no, the next one, back one. Can we go back one slide? That's it. Lovely. Thank you. So to be effective, inclusive innovation has to address different aspects of the way members of society relate to the innovation. And a lot of what we've already heard utilizes ethical principles clearly for including disabled, vulnerable, or other excluded groups. Next slide, please. Can you have the next slide, please? Okay, so what we've heard about in some of the presentations so far is the importance of identifying a potential innovation, thinking of how it might solve a problem, or identifying a problem and thinking about a potential innovation that can solve it. But there are other aspects that need to be considered as well. So, for example, how is it going to fit into the real world? And what I'd like to do more with this particular thought process is to flip the whole thing on its head and not say, you know, how will an innovation solve problems, but what problems might the innovation cause? Or in other words, what might possibly go wrong? And so some of the areas that need to be addressed in that sort of area, you can see on this particular slide. So social and economic impacts, what impact might it have? Public engagement and iteration of the process, gender inclusivity, as we've just heard from Eileen, excluded minority and vulnerable groups, how will they be affected by the new innovation? Equitable access to and benefits of technology. Will some people benefit from it and not others? Does it depend on how much you can afford to pay and so on? And various other ethical aspects that might be raised by the innovation. Next slide, please. So just a brief mention about transformative innovations and disruptive innovations and what the difference is. Transformative ones are generally beneficent. In other words, they generally do you good. They help, they improve society, improve life, and improve health and so on. Disruptive, on the other hand, may be good and bad. It changes things. And very often with disruptive technologies, the outcomes are uncertain. You don't know until the thing's been working for some time as to what can possibly go wrong. Next slide, please. So there are important ethical concerns in innovative emerging technology. So for example, artificial intelligence, robotics, big data, smart homes, synthetic biology are all areas which are really just emerging, although big data's been around for quite a while now, and they can all have problems. They can all have unintended adverse consequences. They can include stigmatization or exclusion. They could have an impact on privacy, autonomy, human rights. They may lead to manipulative or malevolent application of the particular innovation. Or there may be innovations that meet a need or a desire and then become addictive or disrupt societal norms. And we talked a lot about the importance of involving various groups of society to identify innovations and see how they might operate. But if we were to use AI more and more and more, the AI may have enough data, we suddenly can say, oh, we don't need to involve people. We've got so much data about how people think. We'll just get an AI involved in our development. Now, that would be wrong, but it could be, you could see how it could actually happen. Okay, next slide, please. So why is inclusivity, ethics, and co-design so important? Because novel applications can give rise to unexpected ethical and societal issues. And these issues aren't necessarily scientific, but they may relate to people's perceptions, behaviors, and worries. And different people, depending on their circumstances, see things very differently. And if you don't take account of that, that can lead to an innovation failing. Next slide, please. So what could possibly go wrong? That's a question that needs to be asked. And I think in any innovation, any research that's involving developing a new technology, it's essential at some point and at an early point to sit down and to ask as innovators, but also with involving communities and various groups, how might this innovation evolve? How could it actually go wrong? How might it impact or transform human behavior, societies, minority groups, human health, environment, safety? What are the opportunities for malevolent behavior like crime, espionage, political destabilization, weaponry, and more? If you just think about those sort of things and think about something like social media, there's an awful lot of those aspects that social media has affected negatively. And so that it's possible that that can go wrong as well. And so that needs to be thought about. You don't just think about what's a problem we need to solve, think about what could actually happen as well. I don't know if any of you, next slide, please. I don't know how many have seen the series Black Mirror, which it's a Netflix series. I must admit it was my favorite viewing for 2020, I think it was. But it basically looks at lots and lots of different technologies, some of which are with us now, some of which are effectively going to be new ones, and seeing what some of the unintended consequences of those innovations might be. So it's essential for innovators to take time to ask these difficult questions, and then think about how you could avoid some of these unintended consequences that you don't want. Is it through design? Is it through legislation? Is it through education of the way people use them? Next slide, please. So one way you can address that is to develop a checklist and think, for example, what ethical issues does this innovation raise? What groups might it affect? And that's where you need to involve co-creation with other people. Does it have an impact on animals? Does it have an environmental impact? And so on. Next slide, please. So are there any regulatory issues involved? Carry out a risk-benefit analysis, including what might go wrong, how can you mitigate adverse outcomes, and possibly, if you can't, is it worth proceeding with the innovation? And that's a difficult question. Okay, I'm going to leave it at there, so just move on to the next slide, and thank you very much. We'll start with dogs and end with dogs.
Thank you, David. Amazing. Thank you very much. And I would like to say a big thank you to everyone that's been listening since we started this session about an hour, 15 minutes ago. So at this point, we're going to take questions. So please, if you've got questions, please put those questions at the chat area so we can pick them up. While we wait for your question, I think I've got a question for Rosanna. And looking at your presentation, I just want to ask, why is inclusive innovation important? And what are the barriers to inclusive designs or inclusive innovation as we know it?
So I think, yeah, thank you for your question. I think some of our initial thoughts on inclusive innovation are that it might be one step forward from inclusive design, because design is just one part of the innovation process. And we want to achieve inclusivity for the overall innovation process. So we want to achieve this from even before we start the design. It's important to ask citizens from all groups what are the innovations, what technologies they need. And then to move on to develop those things. So yes, the short answer is that inclusive innovation, it is important for the future of innovation, and as all this talk have been highlighting different aspects of responsible innovation and inclusive innovation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I've got a question for Klaus Peters. And it's amazing how you take us through different approaches to how you could include visually impaired or blind persons in designs. And you spoke about Lego, 3D sounds and all that. I would like to know, in your own opinion, which of these methods do you think is most inclusive and effective? Perhaps drawing from your labs?
Okay, thanks for the question. There is no clear answer for that because it really depends on the subject you want to discuss with the people, and it highly depends on the group. I personally, I belong to the group of blind persons. I prefer 3D printing because it has a very good way to provide you very detailed haptic pictures. So this is my personal view. And of course, I like to play with Lego, but this has nothing to do with Lego serious play, because that is very visually oriented. But in our method, which needs to be more developed, we played with the haptic of the Legos, that bricks can move, have different forms, have different surfaces and so on. This is very interesting. And to be honest, when in Berlin at the Lego shop, it was back to the times of childhood, and it was very interesting to pick out all these different bricks and to prepare this workshop. So if you want to know a little bit more about this approach and other ideas, which I only raised very quickly, we put in the chat the link on the document we created on these topics.
Thank you very much. I can see that you already provide some more insight in the chat area. Thank you, Crosspeter. I appreciate that. And I've got a question, two questions, in fact, for Catherine. I'm going to start with the first one. We know that lockdown and COVID-19 motivated the methodical approach, but I still believe you could have done things differently, So the question is, what motivates your methodical approach? And if you're going to do it, I mean, if you have an opportunity to repeat the same research or the same lab today, what are you going to do differently?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I guess the motivation was largely necessity driven. We had to move online. So of course I mean, Roxana's probably best to talk about some of the ideas behind that. But I think really it's, it was really about, I think, trying to find where we could still access people, because of course we couldn't go out. We weren't allowed to even meet people in parks at that point. So it wasn't like we'd be able to do like an outdoor workshop or anything like, there was nothing really other than something online. And one of the issues that we had was that we wanted to make sure it was accessible, because of course, we've got all these amazing collaborative thingamajiggets that like we can all use, like Mural and Miro and all these sort of whiteboards. So you could theoretically do a traditional workshop online, but if you're on your phone, it's not exactly going to be very readable or accessible. And so we really wanted to find a kind of lowest common denominator. And pretty much everybody's got a mobile phone, as we found out. I mean, we recruited a lot through Facebook and WhatsApp. So we knew people were able to at least access the internet through some method. And obviously it wasn't libraries at that time either, because the libraries were all shut. So we thought if they got WhatsApp and they've got Facebook, then they could probably do email. They could probably use their phone camera, and they can probably, have access to Zoom, because I recruited a lot through my mum's group, and my mum's group had Zoom meetings instead of real life meetings. And a lot of people were obviously using Zoom at that point. So we tried to keep it as low common denominator as we could, and accessible in terms of accessibility on mobile phones. So I think that's it. And I think if I were to do it again, I'd actually probably do it the same way. In fact, I'd probably do this again, even if we could go and do an in-person workshop, because I really think it was such a great way to get people in families together, talking about technology, thinking about it from different perspectives, and then engaging with academics, with technologists. It was just a lot of fun, and the benefits of it for the families they seem to really enjoy the aspect. In fact, I was getting emails months after saying, are you going to do this again? Are you going to do it again? You know, can you do one at half term while all the kids are on holiday, you know, off school and that, you know, stuff like that. So that was really, you know, I would probably do it again the same way. I've noticed there's actually a question.
You know, it was great. I was so fascinated by the way you did it and found it so much fun.
Yeah, it was really fun.
It is really inclusive. It was great.
It's honestly I think it's the most fun research I've ever done, and I've done a lot of bizarre things like video game stuff, which is I find really fun. So, but yeah, there's actually, I noticed in the chat there's a question about this. So Indrani asks about the shopping vouchers that we gave them. So those were sponsored by the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility, because obviously the European Commission won't let us do things like shopping vouchers and gift cards and payments and stuff. So yeah, yeah, we weren't allowed to budget those out of the grant agreement, unfortunately. So yeah, they were sponsored by our centre. So.
All right, thank you very much. And I think the last question to Haileen, I mean, you gave some narrative about inclusive innovation for women, speaking about some gender issues there, and you made mention of Lilia and Gabriel as an example. And I'm just wondering, how can we change these narratives?
Well, as an American, I find it wonderful that the European Union requires you know, a gender perspective in all of its projects. However, I'm not sure that Europeans always believe it or necessarily follow the rules. So early into the Live-In project, I asked a question about having women represented on all the design committees, and the response was, well, we have other kinds of diversity. And that actually led to me doing a webinar a few years ago for this project. So what I think is that people have to believe it, take it seriously, and, you know, in all the ways that you can challenge yourself to step outside assumptions. So the things that I would say about women would apply to other areas of inclusivity. But I think many times people think we don't have gender issues anymore. You know, we have these 30% rules that women have to be represented on boards and whatever. But I'm not sure people always take it to heart. So you do a little checklist, just like David's checklist. If you have less than 30% women, what's wrong? You know, and I think that is, and again, I would like to emphasize, this is an issue of we need to recruit people, as all my examples have shown. There's women out there doing it. We're just ignoring it and not seeing it as relevant for other people. So I think a little mental checklist of, wait a minute, why aren't there more people could be an easy first thing, and making sure that we are having representation in all of our, you know, sort of design committees and those activities.
Thank you very much. That's amazing. And this is going to bring us quite closer to the end of this session. But before we leave, we just got two things to do. First, I would like to let you know that tomorrow the summit continues, and we're going to be looking at living in a smart future, home, health, technology, and responsibility. It's going to be the same time tomorrow, and it's going to be interactive discussion with top experts and a youth panel. We'll peep into an exciting new future as experts in smart health, smart home, and Foresight will unveil responsible innovation. And they will work hand in hand with smart future living. So tomorrow, I think it might even be more interesting than we had it today. So I will expect that we all please make it a day tomorrow. And before we leave, there's going to be a short survey. We just want to know how interesting this session has been. Also, we'll appreciate your feedback. It's going to help us to improve this kind of session next time we want to do that. All right, so thank you so much. And on this note, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to everyone that's made it time to attend. Thank you so much. And then I say have a wonderful evening and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and Bye-bye.